We'll do a review on Likutei Sichos in Chelik Chavtes. This is volume 29. This is the first Sicha for the Parshas Reeh. And this Sicha, the Rebbe explains why is it that in the Mishkan was on a flat. It was all at the same level. Whereas the Beis Hamikdash over there was on a mountain and you had to go up from one part of the Mishkan to the other parts, all the different parts of Kedusha, you always had to go up. The Rebbe explains that the Mishkan's main function was not to establish a Kedusha in the place, and therefore it was only a temporary dwelling, and therefore the differences didn't really weren't necessary in the heights as opposed to where it makes a difference in the place, therefore it is adjusted according to each level of Kedusha. The Rebbe wonders how come by the Kodesh HaKadoshim, however, was at the same level, over there was equal, as we'll see in a minute in the Rambam, and the Rebbe says that the Kedusha that you bring down in the Beis Hamikdash, in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, is a total higher level which cannot be achieved through an elevation, and therefore it is actually the same level, as we'll see in great detail in the Sicha. We're learning the Sicha in loving memory of Harav Levi Yitzchak ben Rabbi Chaim Tzvi, Tehei Nishmos Yitzrura B'Tzrur HaChayim. And we'll start, and Be'ezras Hashem, we'll go step by step. Reeh, Aleph. In Hilchos Beis HaBechira. So this is in the laws of Beis HaBechira, and Perek Vav, and the Rebbe is discussing here Halacha Aleph through Daled in chapter 6. Zog the Rambam writes there, the Rambam says, Hamikdosh kuloi loy hoyo b'mishoy elo b'mayla hohor. The Mikdosh, the sanctuary, was not flat, but it was on the elevation of a mountain. And he goes further, continues and articulates the details of the difference and the different elevation as you were going up the mountain, the different places in the Mikdash. And he says as follows. Nichnas Mishar Mizrachi. The Rebbe will explain this also towards the end of the Sicha, but the Rambam describes these different levels, elevation, that when a person enters to the Har HaBayis, to the Temple Mount, from the gate of the east, the eastern gate, entering up to the Har HaBayis, Shal Har HaBayis, Mahalich ad Soif HaCheil B'Shoveh. So then, when he walks till the end of the area, which is called the Chel, the round surrounding of the Mikdash, until then, that's all on flat. That's all b'shaveh, that's flat. You don't go, it's not elevation. And then, be'oile min hachel le'ezras hanoshim, from the area which is the Chel to the women's section, you walk up there b'shteim esrei milas. There's 12 steps to walk up from the Chel to the women's section to the Ezras Noshim. And then the Ezras Noshim itself, u'mahalach kol Ezras Hanoshim b'shaveh. Then you go the entire person, we're talking about the person walking up from the east gate, he continues, he goes up with those 12 steps, and then the Ezras Noshim, the women's section is flat, b'shaveh. That's the whole women's section. And then v'oila mimeno le'ezras Yisrael. And then from the Ezras Noshim, it goes up to the men's court, to the men's Azorah, and that men's court, which really starts Shutchilas HaAzorah, that is considered the holy part, which is the Azorah, the courtyard, begins at the Ezras Yisrael. So you go up the 12, you go up from the Ezras Yisrael, from the Ezras Noshim to Ezras Yisrael, you go up with 15 steps. You have 15 steps going up to the Ezras Yisrael. And then further, then you would be going up flat the entire Ezras Yisrael. And then then you come to the Kohanim's courtyard, the Azor, the section of the Kohanim. The Maila Gavoya Amo. So you go up a step which is high in Amachulu. And then you would walk flat the entire courtyard of the Kohanim, and the Mizbeach was there. This is the outside. And from there you would go up to the Ulam. That was the big room in front of the Migdosh, was called the Ulam, the big hall. You would go up B'shtei Mesra Maila. There were 12 steps to go up into the Ulam. And the Ulam and the Heichel, the room where there was actually the Mokim, the Migdosh, with the Heichel, the rooms of the Beis HaMikdash is all flat, all equal. So here, the Rambam seems to make a very clear emphasis and to tell us that the Migdosh was not flat. He starts off with the negative to tell you what it wasn't before he tells you what it is. He doesn't just say the Mishkan was sitting on the Temple Mount and therefore you had to go elevation. He tells you that it's not flat. Why does he start off saying it's not flat? Because the Rebbe explains the assumption might be, since the Beis HaMikdash is a continuation of the Mishkan, and in the Mishkan, the assumption is that the Mishkan in the desert was on flat land, and also wherever it was constructed, the assumption is that it was flat land. So one would have an expectation, since the Beis HaMikdash needs to be a continuation, follows the Mishkan, maybe it should be on flat land too. So the Rambam starts off right away to tell you, no. The Migdosh was not in flatland. Those was the Rambam fängt on. What does this the reason that the Rambam begins and adds what it was not, the shlila, negation, that it was not flat. Hamigdash kulei loy haya b'mishar. It was not in the flatland. Ela b'mayla ha'har, but it was on the elevation of the mountain. He doesn't just say the Mikdash was on the elevation, but he starts off by saying that it was not flat. Why doesn't he just say the obligation? The positive, not what it was not, but what it was. He should have said the chiyuv, what it is, that it was going up a mountain. So Yesh Leimar, so the Rebbe explains it as follows. Since, according to the Rambam's view, is the kiyum mitzvahs asei v'osul migdosh by boyim dem beis hamikdash. The fulfillment of the positive mitzvah, which Hashem said when they were building the Mishkan, Hashem says, the verse says, v'osul migdosh, make for me a migdosh. That was the instruction when they built the beis hamikdash. And so according to the Rambam, we fulfill the mitzvah of making a sanctuary, which the Eibishter told them by the Mishkan, behemshech to Mishkan she'oso Moshe Rabbeinu b'midbar. That's a continuation of the Mishkan that Moshe Rabbeinu made in the desert. Ve'erzot in onhefaying hilchos bechira, as the Rambam says in the beginning of the laws of the chosen house, the laws of the Beis Hamikdash, ve'erteicht euch ob dort bei the Dvarim Shebibinyan Habayis. Also, when the Rambam talks about the various things that were in the structure of the Beis HaMikdash, he basically tells you that these are all the same as they were in the Mishkan. So there is a continuation from the Mikdash, from the Mishkan. So there is a thought that the Mikdash should have the same as it was in the Mishkan, which was on flatland. What does the Rambam write when he talks about the vessels of the Beis HaMikdash? The following are the items which are main in the building of the Beis Hamikdash. Oisim by Kodesh, you make a place which is called Kodesh. V'Kodesh HaKadoshim. He says, "V'yiyah lifnei HaKodesh mokim echad." So you have Kodesh, Kodesh HaKadoshim, and before the Kodesh there's one place, v'anikra Ulam, and that is called the Ulam. These are the three sections of the Beis Hamikdash: Kodesh HaKadoshim, Kodesh, and the Ulam. Ushloshtom nikroim Heichal. The three of them, the Ulam, the Kodesh, and the Kodesh HaKadoshim, are all called Heichal. V'oisim mechitza acheres, and then you make a additional partition, another partition, Soviv laheichel, which is surrounds the heichel, rechoika mimeno, which is away from the migdosh. So he compares this, that this should be similar to the curtains of the courtyard that there was in the Midbar, which they built around the Mishkan. They built the chotzer and the kalei hachotzer, those curtains. The chol hamuka b'mechitza zu. So anything that is surrounded in that partition that you create around the Mikdash, shehu ke'ein chatzar el moed. Again, the Rambam equates there, which is similar to the courtyard of the El Moed. Hu hanikra azora, that's called the azora. The hakol nikra migdosh, and all this is called migdosh. So the Rambam writes here an equation and a similarity, what is taking place in the building of the migdosh to what was in the Mishkan. Both from Pashtus Lushoinu is moving. From the simple reading the language, you understand as the dvorim was an iker bebinyan habayis, that these items that are a main in the structure of and building of this house of the Mikdash, zayne ke'ein ubedoyme to them was is given in Mishkan, is similar. It's sort of the same kind and similar to that which was in the Mishkan. So that's the Rambam here when he describes the various different parts of the Mikdash. He's associating it to the parts that there was in the Mishkan. And also, further, we see this equation. Also, later on, in the laws of Beis Hamikdash, which in Perek Zayin, Halach Yud Aleph, he says, as he talks about the three camps that were in Midbar, that to correspond to what took place in the desert, the three camps, similar is also L'Doros. So since the Rambam learns that the Mishkan is the cursor for the Beis Hamikdash, and the Mikdash follows in the same steps as the same way as it worked in the Mishkan, so one can conclude that the Mikdash should be in a flat land. The Riber Voltman gekent meinen, so you could have thought, as geschehen wie der ganze Mishkan is bepashtus gewähne auf ein gleichen Shetach. Just as the entire Mishkan is simply, we don't know that it was any higher or lower, it was on one flat area. Nicht ein Teil hecher von dem zweiten. There wasn't one part of the Mishkan was higher than the other. Is ba'ifin gazech given the Mikdash, similar way was the Mikdash. I mean, again, they could build it all on the flatland or straight carve out on a mountain, but they could be all, perhaps everything was on a flatland. That even fangt on the Rambam, that's what Rambam begins with. Mit hamikdash kuloi loy hoy b'mishon. Just to let you know, the Mikdash was not on a flatland. Vidar Mishkan, it doesn't fit the Mishkan, ela b'mayla hor. That's why it was on the top, on the elevation of the mountain. So basically, the Rebbe explains why the Rambam starts off the statement, instead of saying that the Mikdash was on a slant going up on the mountain, instead of saying, he says it was not on a flat land, but rather, why did he have to start off with what it was not? Why doesn't he just say it was on the slant of the mountain? Is because there is an expectation based on what the Rambam has written before, that the Mikdash should fit the similar way the way it was in the Mikdash by the Mishkan. By the Mishkan, all parts of the Mishkan were on the same level, Pashtus. So maybe that's the way we should do the Mikdash. So the Rambam has to start off and says, no, no, no. This was not the case, but over there, by the Mikdash, it was on not flat, but it was on the elevation of the mountain. So the Rebbe wants to know, what is this halacha part of this from the Rambam, that the Rambam is telling us here, teaching us the halacha about how the elevation was built. And we have to understand why Taka is it different than the Mishkan? Why is it in the Mishkan that it was made all on the flat, same area? And by the Mikdash, it actually went up the different levels as the different parts of the Mikdash. As the Rebbe will explain further in Noise Base. Noise Base. The Rambam is doch a sefer von halachas. The Rambam is a book which gives us laws. It doesn't just tell us history. He's move on, so it's understood. Those was the Rambam is metayr. The fact that the Rambam describes that it was not on a flat land, but it was on the elevation of the mountain. Is nit bloß der Fall, weil so ist gewend the Tzuras Habayis bepoil. It's not just because the fact was that the shape of the Beis Hamikdash was that it was going up, so the Rambam just tells you what happened over there. But since it's a halaches, it wasn't just telling you, describing what the shapes are. The Mikdash is given Geboit of Ahar. Since it was built on a mountain, so you had to go up. It continuously goes up on a slat. That's why the different portions of the Beis Hamikdash needed to be higher and higher, because practically speaking, it's built in a slat. So the Rambam tells you how it went, which the pieces, how we went, kept on going higher. But we have to say that is more than that. Now, this is an inyan shaloch. We have to say this is some halacha over there. In Mikdash Kuloi, in the entire Mikdash, that it's a Mikdash that it has to go up. On in Beide Protim, and in the two details, that it's necessary from the halachic point that the Mikdash should not be flat, and also that we have to go up. Beide Protim, both details. What it's not supposed to do, where it's not supposed to be, and the way it has to be. The Mikdash Kuloi, the entire Mikdash Aleph Darv Zayin nit b'misher. The Mikdash does not be a flat land. Like he says, lahoya b'misher. First thing he says, it wasn't flat. Un ella, and the number two base, at Darv Zayin b'may lahor, it needs to be at the slope as the mountain goes up on the elevation of the mountain. And this is part of the halacha. And the fact is that the Rambam's use of not just talking like matter of fact, that the Mikdash was on a mountain, not on a flat land, but it says the fact, Loi Ella, it doesn't say that it goes up. It's not flat, it goes up. It says Loi Ella, which is a stronger way of saying was not but, meaning that this is an absolute condition that the Mikdash needs to be on elevation. That's why it says it wasn't flat, but rather it was elevation, to tell you that this is an absolute condition. This is a halacha that the building of the Mishkan needs to be on a slope and not on a flat. You say the Mezuya Shleimer, and more than this we can say For them was the Rambam is medayik zu sagen beloschen loy elo. The fact that the Rambam specifically uses the word loy elo, unit amigdosh kulei hoya b'mayla hahor v'loy b'mishar. Not just saying that the entire Mishkan was on an elevation, not on a flatland, but it says it was not, but is mashma. It appears this is not an inyan nor lechatchila. This is not just something. To begin with, this is the way we should build the Mikdash. Not atanai kuva, but this is actually a condition that would hold back. You cannot build a Mikdash on flat land. That would be a problem to prevent, even after the fact, of having a Mikdash which is on flat land. So, this is so important, Rebbe says, because the Rambam is telling us this in Halacha, that it's so important that the Mikdash needs to be on the slope, and it's something which would hold back even the Beis HaMikdash. Well, why is it, Takid, that there is such a difference between the Beis HaMikdash and the Mishkan? The Mishkan was on flatland. And here we're saying it has to dafke be different, but on a slope. Ibal does there be in Hamikdash is a hemshech for mitzvahs v'asul Mikdash. Since the building of the Mikdash is a continuation of the mitzvah of making a sanctuary, the fulfillment of this mitzvah started when you built the Mishkan. And we already said that those items which are main parts of the structure of the Beis HaMikdash, they are similar to the items that were in the Mishkan, as the Rebbe said before, from the Rambam. That means that it's a continuation. That's part of the Osuli Mikdash. So what is the Hasboreh? So what's the explanation? Was in them inyan, in this aspect, darf the Mikdash sein anders from the Mishkan, that here the Mikdash needs to be different than the Mishkan. Mishkan on flatland, and this is on a slope on the elevation. Now, you might argue that's not the only difference. There's a lot of difference with the Mishkan. Yet the Mikdash was a hemshech from the Mishkan. But yet, there is differences. So first of all, we have to understand all the differences. And second of all, some changes are understood because they were built from different material in a temporary way. So there were certain things that they did in the Mishkan different than the Mikdash. That's logical. But here, in this part, we don't understand what's the difference. On Afal P. So although, as the Beis HaMikdash is given in Asach Perotim anders from the Mishkan, that the Beis HaMikdash was in many details different than the Mishkan. For starters, the measure of the Mikdash was different. And there were many details in the building itself. So why are we asking a question? Why is the Mishkan on a flatland and the Mikdash is on a slope? What's such a question? There's a lot of changes. So the Rebbe says, no, it's not the same thing. The number one, yeah, but there's also a reason. What's the reason there? So we need to explain that. Just because we have a question over there doesn't answer why the difference between a slope and flatland between the Mikdash and the Mishkan. But based Bekama Mahem is the Tam Pashut. Several of these differences is a very simple reason. The Mikdash is given the Mikdash also was from stones and similar, so it was a different kind of a structure. It was a Sach Gereser and Hecher Mishkan. It was much larger and much higher than the Mishkan. The Baal that is given Ledoidus because it was meant for many generations. In Zalba North, it's in the same place with Yetzibay. So there's a difference of building something which is permanent, staying in the same place. And it was larger and bigger. And Gimel, number 3, here it's not just that it's different, but there's a whole big emphasis. Though Davke is man madgish, ubeprotis gedoyla, you emphasize in very detailed, in great detail, as Hamikdash kulei lo hoyu b'mishar v'der Mishkan. The Mikdash entire was not on flat land as the Mishkan, as the Rebbe explained that the Rambam's intention is. It was not like the Mishkan. It was lo hoyu b'mishar. It wasn't flat land. But my lahor was on the elevation of the mountain. on the slope of the mountain. So why is the emphasis? So the Rebbe says, while there is other differences between the Mishkan and the Mikdash, so we actually need reasons for everywhere, but that doesn't answer it why it's different over here. Some of the differences we can understand. This was a permanent for many generations. It was made out of stones. So it has different measurement, different purposes. And the main thing over here, the number 3, the Rebbe says that over here, there's an emphasis that this is different than the Migdash, Mishkan, than the Mishkan. Mishkan was flat. This is Loyev Mishel Mailah. So the Rebbe will explain now that these elevations of the mountains, it's not just a physical thing. The reason why there was elevation of the mountains is because that represents the elevation of the level, a higher level of the items that were continuously built. They went up higher, that you were going from place to place, from one level to the next level, because they represent a greater level. This representation only needs to be done by the Migdosh, which was a permanent, but not by the Mishkan, was a temporary, as the Rebbe complains. I will explain over here. We can say the explanation is the Chilukei Mekoimes was eine Gewen b'Mikdosh b'Mayla Hahor. The difference of the places that were in the Mikdash as you were going up the mountain was der Chiluk von ein Chelik zum Zweiten is given be'ofen shel ali b'Maylas. This distinction, and how would you go from one part to the next part? You had to go on steps. Is given be'ofen shel ali b'Maylas. You had to go up on steps. Seinen Behesem, that fits their meat, was jeder von say, hat in sich hat that each one of these levels that you had to go up through steps brought about an addition in holiness, an aliyah b'kedusha l'gabe the mokim farem, relative to the place that preceded it. This is an elevation. This physical elevation represents the elevation of the place that was before him. The Rambam zokt in Perik Shalachriza, as the Rambam says in the next chapter, the various different levels of kedusha in the Beis Hamikdash. So based on this, we can say as der din that this halacha from Hamikdash kuloi lahoye b'mishra b'mala hahor, that the Mikdash entirely was not on flat land, but it was on the elevation of the mountain, is verbunden mit der aliyas hadarges shebekedushas hamikdash. That is associated, that is tied to the elevation of the levels that are in the sanctity of the mikdash. That's why there was the corresponding elevation. You had to go higher. Yeder chelik hamikdash velchet is hecher in shetach mekoymei. Every part, a part of the Mikdash, which is higher in area, which is on a higher slope, upper, got a higher level of Kedusha. So these elevations weren't just physically because they're on a mountain, but this corresponds and this fits with the actual higher level of Kedusha as you were going up the mountain. And that's why this halacha is only in the Mikdash and not in the Mishkan. But those was the Chilukei Dargis B'Kedusha Shafen Adin in Zeir Shetach HaMikdash, because that the different levels of Kedusha create a halacha as the area of the place, so that a higher Kedusha needs to be on a higher level. That association, that a higher level in Kedusha needs a higher level in area on the slope, is verbunden mit Gerder HaKedusha, was is netzchadish geworden in Mikdash. That is associated, that is tied to the definition of Kedusha that was renewed, or it was a novelty in the Mikdash that wasn't there before. Legabe Kedusha Mishkan. Relative to the Kedusha Mishkan, The Mishkan did not have kedusha in place that mirrored the kedusha of the holiness, that it should manifest itself in place. The manifestation of that kedusha in place in area only became with the building of the Beis Hamikdash. That's what in them. What's the explanation? That the general Mishkan did not connect to space. It was just a traveling. It went from place to place. The Beis Hamikdash was a chosen permanent place for that structure. So therefore, the spaces within it makes a difference. That's what it does. There is a main difference vision, the Mishkan and the Beis Hamikdash, between the Mishkan and the Beis Hamikdash. The Mishkan is given a binyan aray. The Mishkan was a temporary structure. The pasuk says, the Eibusha says, I would be traveling in a tent, in a Mishkan, but not a house. And to use the Rambam that we mentioned before as the Mishkan also Moshe, the Mishkan that Moshe Rabbeinu built was temporary. Mashenke, the Beis Hamikdash, is given Adiras Kvar, as opposed to the Beis Hamikdash was a permanent home. Rambam, to use again the language of the Rambam, Kivon Shenivna Hamikdash v'Yerushalayim, once the sanctuary was built in Yerushalayim, Nesru Kol HaMekayim Kulam, so all places have become prohibited. Livnei Behem Bayis LaHashem, to build a structure to Hashem. Can't build a mikdash anywhere. Ulakri Behem Korban, or to bring in them a korban, no other place. There is no other structure for generations, Elo b'Yerushalayim Bilvad, only Yerushalayim, u'Bahara Reeh, and Mount Reeh. That's the only place. So that's the permanent place. So there's a major difference. The Mishkan was temporary. It was a binyan aray, and the Beis Hamikdash was a permanent structure. So what's the difference as far as kedusha? Und der Unterschied zwischen sie in Gedra kedusha is, and the difference between the Mishkan and the Mikdash as far as the holiness is defined, that rests there. In Mishkan is the Chalois HaGedusha given be'iker in the Binyan v'Chalokov. In the Mishkan, the main sanctity rested in the structure, not in the place where the Mishkan was, where it traveled, but rather in the pieces, the parts of the Mishkan, the building and its parts, the Kuroshim, the Yiriyas, the beams, the curtains, the covers, Hulu. They have been anointed with the anointment oil, and they were all the time. The structure, the building, the Kuroshim, they went all along. Not the place, but the building was there all the time, that structure. In Zay is not given Kirshinui. There was no change in the beams and the curtains. They were that was the holy part. But in Beis Hamikdash, in the Beis Hamikdash, however, is there given Kiddush Smokeh. There was also a sanctity of the place. That Etzem Mokim HaMikdash is the Kaddish geworden. The actual place of the Mikdash became sanctified. Und in zwei Sachen. In two ways was the actual sanctified. The place. Number one, Davke b'negei lebeis hamikdash zokmen b'parshasenu, that it is only with regards to the sanctuary we say hamokoim, the place asher yivcha Hashem elokeichem boy. Hashem chose the place. The Mishkan was the Mishkan, not in the place. But here is the Bechira in the place. It's the place of the Beis Hamikdash was built. And Beis is given the Maisa Kiddush from Karka, Ritzpah, that they sanctified the ground, which is the floor of the Migdosh Chulu, as the Gemara Rebbe referenced in the Gemara in Zvachim and in the Rambam in different areas, that there was a sanctity to the place, to the floor of the Mishkan, so that it became, the place itself became sanctified. So there's a difference. By the Mikdash, the Mishkan did not impact the place, whereas the Beis Hamikdash did impact the place. Now, we do find, even in the Mishkan, there is something about the earth of the place where there was the Mishkan, and therefore, by a soita, we have a halacha that you take from the sand of the Karka Mishkan. So there is also, but it's still not in a way of the permanence. The Torah said that you should take from there. Let's look inside. Even though, as it is relates to the Mishkan, there's the verse states by Asoita, that from the sand that's in the floor of the Mishkan, the Kohen takes. So you see there's a sanctity also in the sand which is below in the Mishkan. But that doesn't change it, the Rebbe says. He says, that sand was only used for the Soita at that time, temporarily. Couldn't use the sand of the place where the Mishkan stood before. Even at the time that you did use it, it says, it wasn't because that there was a sanctity in the place even at the time. V'karka mitzad atzmei, or the ground on its own had the kedusha. Nor mitzad the oil moyed yiriyus ukroshim. But it was because of the oil moyed yiriyus ukroshim. Hamishkon welcher is gestanden auf der karka. It says hier bekarka hamishkon. It's the karka of the mishkan. The mishkan which was standing on the karka, that karka mishkan was used, but not karka in itself. It wasn't the karka, it wasn't the ground itself, the earth itself, because there was really no kedusha by the temporary mishkan on the place in which it rested. Umahai taimo is the achilik tzvishem mekoim hamishkan umekoim hamikdash. That's why there's also a difference between the place where the mishkan stood and the place of the Beis Hamikdash. After the people moved on from one trip to the next trip, the place where the Mishkan stood before had no Kedusha, as opposed to the Kedusha of the Beis Hamikdash remains. As by Mishkan, after they took her apart and they traveled from there, in the first place, there was no Kedusha left. Just like by Matan Torah, after Har Sinai by Matan Torah, that once the trumpet blew, the shofar blew, then they can go up on the mountain. Meaning that the Kedusha was there only for the time being, but it wasn't something that remained. That was by the Mishkan. Mashenkim by Beis Hamikdash is the din, but the halacha by the Beis Hamikdash. The Rambam paskin, the Rambam rules, as makrivim hakorbonis kulo. You can bring all the korbonis. You don't even need a Beis Hamikdash. Afa pisha einshom bayis banu, that there is no built home over there. You can eat the Holy of Holies and all of the Azora, and there's no Beis Hamikdash, because the ground itself, afa pisha chareva, even though it's destroyed, there's no Beis Hamikdash, and it's not surrounded with mechitza. The kedusha is the ground itself. The place itself has been sanctified because of the divine. It's it's the place that was chosen by Hashem. The bechira is in the mokim. The bechira is in the place. The riber bleibt dort kedusha le'lam. That's why it stays there forever. That's the big difference between the Mishkan and the Beis Hamikdash. The Mishkan was only the holiness of the structure of the Mishkan, but it didn't go to the ground. Even by the Soita, when you took from there, it was just temporary, and because it was the Mishkan around there. But here by the Beis Hamikdash, you see, you can bring korbanos, and you don't even have the structure of the Beis Hamikdash, and you don't even have a wall around it, but you can still eat the Kodesh Kodashim. The sanctity is there. Why? Because Hashem chose that place. This also answers the difference between the elevation level that existed by the Beis Hamikdash, the different holiness, versus the Mishkan. Dalet. Al Pizei's move on. Was Davke Mikdash is given der Chidush. Now we understand why in the Mikdash there was this novelty. As a Mikdash kuloi lahoye b'misher ele b'mayla hahor, that the entire Mikdash was not flat on a flat area, but it was on the elevation. On the Prote Achilukim, and also the details of the different levels in the Aliyas Mimokim Lamokim Beis Hamikdash, from going up from place to place in Beis Hamikdash. Davke in Mikdash was Izdo HaKedusha B'Shayches Tzumokim. Specifically in the Mikdash, where there is a sanctity which is associated, which is connected to the space, Gufa, since the Kedusha by the Mikdash is in this place of the where the Mikdash stands on that place, that Mokim is a Mohakim Asher Yivchar Hashem. It's a place that Hashem chooses, the place. Goimer. Dort Ishayich Zogan, over there we can say, as the Chluka HaKedusha in Mikdash, that there's different levels of Kedusha in Mikdash, as they go up higher sanctity, Shafan Chalukim in Mokim HaMikdash, they also create that distinction in the place of the Mikdash, because as the Kedusha grows, the Kedusha impacts, that's a change in the Kedusha of the space of the Mikdash we're standing on. In Goiva HaShatach von dem Mekoimis, in the height of the area of the different places, mit was ein Mokim is ausgeteilt von zweiten Mokim, that which distinguishes one place from the other place is connected to the Kedusha, because the Kedusha is in the place. That is the Mokim HaMikdash, that it came down into the places. So the different places have different Kedushas. Warum die Kedushas Mokim from Beis HaMikdash, it's not just a general Kedusha in the whole area by area. Warum die Kedushas Mokim from Beis HaMikdash is nicht nur a Kedusha Klolis, not just a general Kedusha. Gleich in dem ganzen Beis HaMikdash, which is equal in all of the Beis HaMikdash. Not as eine doch Chilukei Darges in Kedushas HaMokim, but there is different levels in the Kedusha of the place. Behesem to Darges HaKedusha of the Chalkei HaBayis, as it fits to the levels of Kedusha from the sections of the Beis HaMikdash. The Heichal, the Azora, different creation of different levels of Kedusha. So, at the time, each place had the Kedusha. And that Kedusha that was there at the time also remains in that level of Kedusha for the future. With the Beis HaMikdash, without the Beis HaMikdash, that was different steps in Kedusha as they came down and they stayed that way. From them Mokim Proti, also the specific Kedusha of this particular place is geblieben aufständig. That remains forever. Even though there is no building over there. Wie verstandig euch von dem Rambam Hanal, this is also understood from the above Rambam, as Euchlim Kodesh Kadoshim B'chol Ha'azora Afal Pi Shacharei V'chulu. That we eat Kodesh Kadoshim in all of the courtyard, even though that it is destroyed. But Achilas Kodesh Kodeshim is Mekayim Ba'azora, that you can eat. That's eaten in the Azora. So you see that particular, you can't eat it outside of the Azora, you can only eat it in the Azora, meaning that place, that separate, that level of Kedusha, which you can eat Korbanos in, that remained over there in that space. So this is by the Beis HaMikdash. Masha Enke der Mishkan, was is nicht given in einem Öfen von Kviyas b'mokim. As opposed to the Mishkan was not in a way of set in the place. It wasn't the place that Hashem chose. It wasn't the place, but the Mishkan wasn't. It was the Mishkan that Hashem had the Shekhinah in there, but not the place. Nor Kedushas Mishkan is given in the Chelkei Oyel Moed. The Kedusha of the Mishkan was in the parts of the Oyel Moed. The Karoshim Yiris Chulu, the beams and the covers. The river is by Mishkan it given. Therefore, by the Mishkan there wasn't Nimshich or Nikvik were in the Unterschied. So that difference did not extend, was not said. The Unterschied to Gedushas Chalka Mishkan and the Mokim and Midbar, that difference did not separate itself in the part, in the space in the Midbar. It wasn't about space. It didn't go down to space. So therefore, we don't have a distinction of space in the different parts of the sanctity of the Mishkan. Which is given Arois Chanis Mishkan, where the Mishkan rested temporarily. It didn't make a difference because it didn't come down into the ground. And the far is the Mokim HaMishkan given the Mishkan, and that's why the place of the Mishkan was on a flat land. In Shetach HaMishkan Gufa is ein Mokum von Chelek HaMishkan mitgiven ausgeteilt von a zweiten Mokum. Within the area which the Mishkan stood, the one place of the Mishkan was not distinguished, was not separate from a different place, because it wasn't about the place. In the place there was no manifestation of the Kedusha. In the place there was no difference. And the far is that Rambam madgish dem chiluks. We should Mishkan and Mikdash now understand why he emphasized specifically this distinction. Even though there was other differences that were in the Mishkan versus the Mikdash. The point number 3, the Rebbe spoke before, the Rambam emphasizes that there's a difference between the Mishkan and the Mikdash as far as flatland and elevation. Because this is Valdavke in them was HaMikdash Kula Lahoy B'Mishkan Ma'la Hahor. Specifically in this context, this idea that the Mikdash was not flatland, was an elevation, the Chiluk Aliyas from the Chalki HaMikdash, the different elevations of the parts of the Mikdash, this expresses to us a very fundamental novelty from the Mikdash Lagabe the Mishkan, that the Mikdash is different than the Mishkan. Zayendik the Mokim Mashiach Hashem, to demonstrate the Mikdash is the place that Hashem chooses. That is a distinction that makes this difference. Ma'ila Hahor. Zayendik the Mokim Mashiach Hashem, because it's the place that Hashem chose. But the Mikdash Mechalokov Oivkitonim Mekoimei. So the Mikdash and its part, they accomplished in the place, in Kedushas HaMokim, the sanctity of the place. The Rebbe explains that the differences in the place was dafke accomplished by the Mikdash, and that's why it had to be the elevation. And that's why the Rambam emphasized it, because this was a main area in which there was a novelty of the Beis HaMikdash, that it created this space, the Yivchar Hashem, the space that Hashem chose, which brings about the different levels of elevations, as opposed to the Mishkan, which was just the temporary resting place of there, and that's why there was no differences. However, once we explain this, we need a very good explanation now. So how come this doesn't extend also to the Kodesh HaKadoshim? So since it's talking about, we're saying that this is going up in the higher levels, so why would the Kodesh HaKadoshim, which is definitely higher than the Kodesh, why did you not have to go up on a higher level? Why is it all on the same level? And the Rebbe will explain that that's a Kedusha which is beyond level. It cannot be expressed also in going up through an Aliyah. Hey, if you said Darpen over Verstehen, according to this, we have to understand. Lefi Hanal, based on the above explanation, as the Aliyah is in Shetach HaMokim, that these elevation in this space of the area, seine verbunden mit the darkest Schönes Valiyas in Kedushas HaMokim, are tied, associated with the various level and elevation in Kedushas HaMokim. Was Hechers is given the Kedusha from Chelek HaMikdash, the higher the sanctity of the part of the Mikdash, als Hecher is given, sein Shetach HaMokim, that higher was the place. So how come there were steps, and a lot of steps, to go up to the Kodesh HaKadoshim? that was much higher. So if there's a manifestation in the elevation in the steps to go up to the higher place, why isn't there an elevation to the Kodesh HaKadoshim? The Kodesh HaKadoshim is doch given Kishmoi Kodesh Lagaba Kadoshim. Kodesh HaKadoshim, the holiest of the holiest, as the name would say, it's holier than even the holy. It's Kodesh Lagaba Kodesh Kadoshim. Ois Gitel Migudushosoi from Allah Chalki Abayis. He is distinguished in his holiness from all portions of the Beis HaMikdash. And with the Rambam Firto is invited to Kiperi. And the Rambam concludes in the next chapter, as the Hechster Kedusha is in Bais Kodesh HaKadoshim. He says clearly over there that the greatest, the highest level of Kedusha. It talks about all different levels of Kedusha, but the highest level is the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Is in Bais Kodesh HaKadoshim. The only one who enters there is the Kohen Gadol. Ayim Kippur, when he does the service, so that should have been higher. It should have been a much higher in the area and the place. You should have needed to go up to the Kodesh HaKadosh. How come there were no steps? There was no elevation there. But das Verstehen behegdim Abir Bahanal will understand this by first explaining the above in a hefresh between Mishkan and Mikdash, the difference between the Mishkan and the Mikdash, leiten Signon from Toras HaChasidus, in the style of the Hasidic teaching, to understand the difference of the Mishkan and Mikdash. While the Rebbe explained now the different Mishkan and Mikdash in the general terms, the Rebbe is going to explain now in the language of Hasidus. The Mishkan was given Adidas Arai Kaviyachol zum Ebersten. The Mishkan, which was a temporary dwelling, so to speak, from Hashem, is given gebuit von Eitzim, that was built from wood. That's the Kroshim. That was the main, that's the level of Semeach. That's growing. So we have Doimem, inanimate, we have Semeach, growing, and then we have Chai. So the parts of the walls of the Mishkan was wood. Wood is Semeach, growing. On Urias. And then you had also covers. Some of the covers came from living. The only thing is, so you had Semeach and Chai, and only the floor was made of doimen, was earth. Lois the karka, making event. Only the ground that you raised it temporarily was given doimen offer. Only the ground was doimen offer. So in the Mishkan, it was Semeach and Chai, and only the ground was the doimen. In the Beis HaMikdash, as opposed to the Beis HaMikdash, was given Adidas Kvar Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which was a permanent dwelling place of Hashem. It's given Geboit Beikir from Avonim. It was mainly built out of stones. And we know Vein Boinim Boyetz Boyet Klal Eloi Bavonim Bilvenim. The Rambam writes you're not allowed to build a protruding wood in the Beis HaMikdash at all. Either wood or bricks, but no wood, no protruding wood. That means that everything in the Beis HaMikdash needs to be not growing, not semeach, but dafke doimen. Was is nidriker for sugat semeach b'chai, which is on a lower level than the category of growing and living. Mishkan was mainly made out of growing and living, and the Beis HaMikdash has to dafke be made out mainly only of doimen. So the Tabazeh, so Chassidus gives the reason for this. In Yonei Shel Mishkan is given nit as so feel zu poil sein. The idea of the Mishkan wasn't so much to impact Ashinui Kavu and Gashmis Ha'olam, to make a permanent change in the physicality of the world. Nor Be'ikir, mainly the Mishkan was to upspringlen, to reflect, to mirror them Seder Hishtalshlus the Olamis, the order of the Hishtalshlus of the world. So the Mishkan was built in a way that it reflects the way the world is Nishtalshul. from Chai, Semeach, and then Doimer. The river is the Binyan HaMishkan Given Behesim, and that's why the Mishkan was built, that it fit with the Inyonim, where in Nimshach and Seder Ishtalshlus, how these ideas are drawn down in the order of the way they evolve, the way they evolve from the higher level to the lower level. The Michsa, Mishkan Lemaila, the cover of the Mishkan above, which is the higher level, is given from Chaya. That was also had living over there. Azoyat, the Izim Shalamato, the lower goat Yirias were made out of goats. Umberubam, the Iruas, Umberubam, the Yirias Shalmatamem. And those covers that were below them were mostly made out of the Yirias Izim, all growing thing. So then below that, there was also, so this was the Chaya, Lamata Mizah. These were the top in the covers. The higher ones were the Chaya, the Izim were below. The upper one was also living. Then below that, Lamata Mizah, which is Mi'uta Diriyas HaMishkan. That was the minority of the Yirius of the Mishkan. They made it from the woven things that comes from the Tzemeach, the various different strands. But that was also, that was made from Tzemeach, and also the lower parts of the Mishkan, which was the beams that were below the cover of the Mishkan. Karsha Mishkan is grown from Tzemeach. That was from growing things. And then when it goes even lower, the Adonim, we talk about the sockets, and the Karka Mishkan, and the ground of Mishkan. It's given Kesef offer, that was silver, and the sand, which was diamond, inanimate. So the structure of the Mishkan worked according to from the higher level to the lower level, from the Chai, the lower to the Daimon, to the Tzemeach, and then the Tzemeach to the Daimon. That was was a reflection of Ishtalshelus. But the Yisrael and Oiftu from Beis Hamikdash Lagabe the Mishkan, the advantage and what the novelty of the Beis Hamikdash relative to the Mishkan is in them consisted was durch im 40 ois the kavona that through the Mishkan accomplishes the intent from Isava Kodesh Baruch Hu Liyas Le'dir B'Tachtonim that Hashem desired to have a dwelling place in this lower world. Dafkin, as the kedusha, the Ashros Hashchina, that the sanctity and the resting of the divine so nimshach them und durchnehmen and develop. That should extend and it should penetrate into the world. Bis zu der niedrigste Darge von Gashmius Ha'olam, to the extent that it goes to the lowest level of the physicality of the world. What we're trying to accomplish, the Eibishter wants the Beis Hamikdash to fulfill his intention to, in the lower level of the world, should be the Kedusha penetrating it. The resting of the divine should be in the lowest levels of Kedusha. It should penetrate, go through. Also the category of inanimate. In which you don't see openly, you don't see any life, you don't see spirituality, you just see inanimate thing, you don't see any life there. But that's the purpose, to get there also the Migdash Tachton. Uvebaldas the Beis Hamikdash is in Yonei, and since this is the idea of the Beis Hamikdash, so Mamshech Zayin Hashros Hashchinen Welt, to draw down the Shechina resting in the world, Ba'ofen as the Kedusha soll durchnehmen und miles and the Gashmis in such a way that sanctity should penetrate and elevate the physicality. Der Pfarrer hat sich das ausgedrückt, euch in der Gashmisdike Metzies from Weltkufa. So that's why it expressed itself also in this physical existence of the world. What was the Beis Hamikdash made out of? Out of the inanimate, the lowest part of where we want to make the Betachtonim. As der Ort, wo der Beis Hamikdash is gestanden, is given Behor. That the place that the Beis Hamikdash stood was on a mountain. To take these lowest levels, elevate them, bring them up to the mountain. It's higher than the places. To take that physicality and elevate them to the higher place, higher than place around it. And the greater, the higher, the elevation, and the steps in the Kedusha and the Mikdash, so the higher physically also was the physical space got higher. In their Mishkan, as opposed to the Mishkan. Was Iked in Yone is not given as the Ashros Ashkine Shaboy. So Duchnem Gashmi Sa'ilom Bizdem Reeh. When we talk about the Mishkan, its idea of the Mishkan wasn't to elevate, to have the divine present encompass and go through the physicality of the world up till the inanimate. The more is the ground. That the lowest is nothing low. The Reeh is the Ashros Ashkina and the Kedusha Shaboy. So therefore, the resting of the divine and the Kedusha in it, it's as if it remains separately. This did not mirror in the physical. There was no elevation, there was no mountain there. It was just flat because you didn't see how it impacts the world, that it's in a higher place, that you don't see it in a physical demonstration, that it reflects in the fact, the mirrors, that it always goes higher. The River Chochi Mishkan Zainen, given Chilukim, although in Mishkan there was differences, in Dargus HaKedusha, the different levels of Kedusha, this is over given Hamokim Ba'olam Hazeh, but how did it come out in this world? Kulev Mishra was all flatland, because it didn't express the elevation in the Nit Oivgehoiben Behesen Madreges HaKedusha. This was not raised to fit the level of Kedusha. No, the Kedusha is in the Mishkan, and the earth is its earth. It didn't connect, so there was no reflection in it. By the Beis Hamikdash, the Kedusha, because it was meant to elevate the Gashmis, it was reflected in the fact that it was in a higher place. But here it didn't, it was B'mishir. I feel it was at the same level with the place of the Midbar. You didn't see how this elevated in any way the place of the Mishkan. And that's why the Mishkan was on a flat land. So the difference, the Rebbe explains, the Mishkan was mainly not to impact the Dire B'Tachtonim, but mainly to reflect the way it's above, the levels of above, the level of Chai, the level of Tzemeach, and Doimim. But the Beis Hamikdash was to impact the Tafkid, the Doimim. It was all made from them. And that's why the Mikdash had an impact on the physical place. It was built on a har to reflect on the different levels that they impacting the world. But the Mishkan did not really appear to change the world. It was in a flatland. It's the same thing as the rest of the desert. The Kedusha was just in the Mishkan itself. So this also explains now, the Rebbe explains why the Mikdash was not on a higher place, doesn't express that elevation. Because this is a much higher level than being expressed in that elevation. But based on this, also understood that time, the reason, why the Kodesh HaKadoshim in the Mikdash and the Mikdash The Mokum Am Kudish B'Yoser, that was the highest level of Kedusha, the most holiest of everything, is nit given oisgeteilt begovhoi from the Heichel HaMikdash, was not distinguished in its height from the regular room of the Mikdash. Because der Inyan as the Kedusha Ruchnis from Mikdash, poilt in them aliyah from Gashmis the Mokim, this idea that the spiritual sanctity of the Mikdash impacts, influences, and it makes the elevation of the physical place higher and higher. And because of that, one place is higher than the other. According to the levels in Kedusha. Is Shaykh Benegeya Zelcha Madreges in Kedusha that only applies to such levels in Kedusha. Was the Niedrige Dargi is Berech der Herchere, that the lower level is at least compared to the higher level. Hecher, nor b'shteinas milos. It's higher, but it's only 12 steps here. It's a limited higher. Or similar. But when we're talking about a level in Kedusha, which is uncomparably higher, bis zu sein Hecher von dem Geder from Mailamata. It's so much higher that it's not even higher and lower, it doesn't apply there. By a dargin, when we talk about a step that is greater, elevated, uncomparably, is that Shaykha doesn't sich ausdrücken in that soul trap. You can't have this express itself in several steps, miles, which is elevation. In Goiva Motu the Mukbal, in elevation, which is measured and limited, saying, oh, you went up higher. And then it cannot express itself, oh, it's in a higher physical place. It is just uncomparably higher to represent high in physical height. And this is the And this is the difference between the other part of the Mikdash and the Kodesh HaKadosh. Chelke HaMikdash is the Kedusha von einem Hecher. The parts of the Mikdash is a sanctity that one is higher, but still comparable of a Berach. Hot anerach to the Mechelik of Madrekes HaKedusha Smucha has a comparison to the part and the steps of Kedusha which is next to it. It's higher, but it's comparable. Umasim lechiluk ha'erech, and to fit the difference of how they compare is the chiluk b'neihem. That is the difference between them in the mispar and goyva ha'mailis b'mokum l'moil. The number and how many steps you have from place to place fits the level of height. Ein that is hecher von zweiten neich bekashmis. One is higher, and then the other also physically. Aber by the kedusha from kodesh hakadoshim. But when we talk about the Kedusha of the Holy of Holies, was dort is given, there was Gilui, Bahamokim. The revelation of the place was from Atzmus, from Lolatz, from Nimna Nimnois, who was preventable in the place of the Kodesh HaKadoshim. There was no contradictions over there. You can have the Mokim HaOrin, in the Mokim HaOrin, Sheinim and Amidah. You have the Orin have a measure, and yet it is not measured at the same time. It's Nimna Nimnois. So it is not measured and measured at the same time. But since that's uncomparably at all to all the other parts of the Mikdash. Hecher b'chlal from them together from Mailamata. This is higher than higher and lower. It's in a different realm. Azah hecherkeit, such a kind of an elevation, such a guy of height, this cannot be expressed. Afilu became Remez V'dugma, not even in a hint or a similar, but just make it a little higher. No, in Agoiva from Amakum Gashvi, higher and physical cannot express that. But he's more to the mukbal because physicality is measured and limited. We cannot express the highness of the Kodesh HaKadoshim, and therefore it remains the same because it's not possible to express that. expressing that would actually be taken away because we can only express a measured level. And the level of the Kodesh HaKadoshim higher is not, there's no higher and lower over there. It's uncomparably higher. So therefore, it's not expressed by higher at all. It remains the same level. And now the Rebbe gives another idea. Zayin Nochanin in them another idea. And the Rebbe explains now that the Rambam says when a person doesn't talk about how it goes, he talks about the person walking in. But the Rambam specifically says, once you enter the east side gate of the top of Mount Mahalech ad Bokim Soifachel, you go to the end of the Chel. And then you go up. It's all talking about the person. Person goes up. And the person continues walking. He walks the whole and he goes up. It's not telling you about the place of the Migdosh that goes up, but it's the person going up. As by the Milas Valerius Retter, that he's not talking about the height of the place on its own, nor the Odom is Mahalach Boila, but rather the person is going and going up. We can say as the Rambam is their meat meramis, the Rambam hints over here. As the Alam Adregis in Kedusha was their mentions Hoylach Medarka Ledarka, that all these steps in Kedusha that a person goes from step to step, he does Ba'ofen Shel Oila, must always go up. As Mus Poil Zayin Aliyah Ba'odam, it must elevate, the person must elevate. Darf sich aufheben und Oila Zayin Medarka Ledarka. He must elevate himself and go up, always going up from a level to level. Shas says, "Kumt over zu Madreges Kodesh Kadoshim." When we come to the level of Kodesh Kadoshim, is not der Eifana der Adam is Hoylach V'Oila. Over there, it's not the person goes, can't go up over there. Steigt Hecher in Zayin Aliyahs B'Kodesh. He can't say, oh, he's gone up to a higher level. But it is Kulei B'Bittel B'Metzias. When you come to the Kodesh Kadoshim, well, you're not going up. You're entirely negated of your own existence, Lagamri Kula B'Shov, it's all equal. Und das ist verbunden mit dem Beis Hamikdash. And this is tied with the Beis Hamikdash, welcher is V'Shachanti B'Soicham, that I dwell within you mit der Bechina from Kodesh HaKadoshim. That's the level of Kodesh HaKadoshim really with the Yid himself. Because it's their Mikdash HaProtim Yednin, it's your individual Mikdash. Pnimi is the Pnimius Halev, the inner of the heart, Bechinas Yechidish Benefesh, the level of Yechid of the soul. Was in him is Nitokin Tzir Vagbola, there is no shape or no limitation. So the Odom over here, in that level, it's no measure. Alachas Kam Vakam and Nitokin is special for sure, there's no expansion. But his Nirmas in the Kodesh Al Hayud, that's hinted on the point which is on the Yud, that's the level of the Yechida. It's only a point because there is no, it's totally bittel, there is no substance, no letter, it's not even a Yud. Yud would be the level of Chochmah. This is the Koitzer Shel Yud. This will be the Yechidish Benefesh. And that's just that point which is a non-Metzias. From that part of his Yechida, the Yid negates and removes himself, removes all his will to become subjugated to him, blessed. One of them is the etzem ha'is kashrus from a Yidin, and in this is the essence of the tie of a Yid. Which is hecher from Gilu V'tzir, which is higher than any form, any shape. Yechida liyachdoch. It's just only to be united with Hashem. That's the level of the neshama, the level of Yechida. Total bittul, no self, nothing there. There's no tzir, there's nothing there. Only the bittul connection to Hashem. That's bedugmas knisas kohen gadol. This is similar to the kohen gadol entering as ashliach from kol amcha beis Yisrael b'chabak m'shein, as the saying the davening that he is representing all the Jewish house of Israel. Wherever they are, he's entering in. And that's Achaz Bashon L'Kodesh HaKadoshim, goes in once a year to Kodesh HaKadoshim. That's the level of going into your level of Yechida. And that's why there's also no steps over there. And there's no elevation. Didn't elevate. They're lost. There's no Metzias there. There's a total level of Bittel. Everything is equal because that's the level of the essence and that's the level of Yechida. This is Mesichos Shabbos Parshas Masay Tov Shin Daled Mem.